The day the ocean didn't go back. It begins with silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that feels wrong. The tide is supposed to go out. Every child in the village knows that. The ocean breathes in. The ocean breathes out. It has done so for generations, for as long as memory stretches. But this morning, it doesn't. The water stays where it shouldn't. Fishermen stand ankle-deep in surf that refuses to retreat. The shoreline looks unfamiliar. The rhythm is broken. Somewhere in the distance, seabirds scream and lift into the sky all at once. Then the ground trembles. Not violently, not enough to knock anyone down, just enough to send a message. Something has shifted. Far out at sea, the horizon darkens. It thickens. It rises. At first, it looks like a trick of the light. Then it keeps rising. And suddenly, the ocean is no longer flat. It is standing up. For most of human history, water has been both life and terror. Rivers feed crops. Rain fills wells. Oceans carry fish. But when water moves without permission, when it invades instead of sustains, it becomes something else. It becomes memory. Nearly every major civilization on Earth tells a story about a great flood. Not a seasonal storm, not a swollen river, a world-ending flood. In ancient Mesopotamia, a man is warned that the gods will drown humanity. He builds a vessel. He survives while the world disappears beneath water. In India, a sacred fish warns a holy man of an approaching deluge. He gathers seeds of life. The waters rise. The old world ends. In China, the legends speak of catastrophic floods that swallowed entire regions and reshaped dynasties. Across the Pacific, the Maya told of earlier worlds destroyed before this one began. Different continents, different languages, different gods, but always the same image. Water rising. Why? For centuries, scholars assumed coincidence. Floods are common. Rivers overflow. Coastal storms devastate cities. Water is the most obvious force of destruction available to ancient minds. But the similarities run deeper than convenience. In many of these stories, the flood is not local. It is total. Mountains vanish beneath waves. Humanity is nearly erased. A small group survives to rebuild civilization from nothing. That is not a description of an ordinary storm. It is a description of a world changing. So here's the question. What if, sometime in the deep past, it did? To understand the possibility, we have to go back, not a few centuries, not a few thousand years, but more than 12,000 years. At the end of the last ice age. The world then did not look like the world now. Vast ice sheets covered North America. Northern Europe lay buried under kilometers of frozen mass. So much water was locked in ice that global sea levels were not a few feet lower. They were lower by more than 120 meters. Imagine draining the ocean by the height of a 40-story building. Entire continental shelves emerged as dry land. There was no English Channel as we know it. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a broad, fertile plain. The North Sea was not sea at all. It was a landscape of rivers, forests, and grazing animals. Southeast Asia was not a scatter of islands. It was a massive peninsula stretching deep into what is now ocean. Humans did not live only inland. They lived on coasts that no longer exist. Because when the ice age ended, the ice did not politely disappear. It melted, and when ice melts, oceans rise. But here is where the story becomes unsettling. Sea level did not rise slowly and gently over millennia like a calm bathtub filling. There were pulses, moments when massive glacial lakes burst, moments when ice sheets destabilized, moments when the ocean surged upward far faster than expected. One of the most dramatic events, known today as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. In geological terms, it was instantaneous. The sea levels rose by roughly 20 meters in a few centuries. That averages several meters per human lifetime. Imagine standing on a shoreline as a child and watching that shoreline move inward every decade. The beach where you played becomes marsh. The marsh becomes shallow sea. Your grandchildren no longer recognize the land where you were born. And this was not happening in one place. It was happening everywhere. Every coastline on Earth was retreating, slowly by our standards, but fast enough to be terrifying, and humans were there to witness it. Picture a community living on a low coastal plain. They fish in tidal flats. They gather shellfish. They build homes near fresh water sources that sit just above sea level. At first, the change is subtle. Storms push farther inland. Now high tides reach places they never touched before. Salt begins creeping into freshwater pools. Then one year, a storm comes that does not recede. The sea eats land and does not give it back. There is no satellite warning, no geological report, no global map. There is only observation. The ocean is advancing, and it is not stopping. What does that do to a culture? What does that do to memory? We often imagine ancient people as primitive observers of nature, but they were not ignorant. They were intimate with their environment. If the shoreline shifted by meters within a generation, they would have known. If a hunting ground disappeared beneath waves, they would have remembered. If a river mouth transformed into open sea, that transformation would have been seared into story. And story, well, long before writing, was survival technology. You tell your children where not to build. You encode danger in myth. You turn disaster into sacred narrative so it will never be forgotten. Because forgetting means dying. Now multiply that process across thousands of coastal communities around the globe. Different languages, different gods, same trauma. Water rose, land vanished. The old world ended. But here is the critical detail. Sea level rise alone is gradual. Even a few meters per century, though devastating, does not create a single catastrophic day. It creates anxiety, migration, loss. Not a singular apocalypse unless something else happened. Around 12,800 years ago, just as the Ice Age seemed to be ending and warming had begun, Earth experienced a sudden and violent reversal. Temperatures plunged. In some regions, they dropped back toward glacial conditions in mere decades. This period is known as the Younger Dryas. Its cause is still debated. Some scientists suggest massive influxes of freshwater into the North Atlantic disrupted ocean currents. Others propose something more dramatic, a cosmic impact, fragments of a comet exploding in the atmosphere. Evidence of widespread wildfires appears in geological layers from this time. Extinctions accelerated. Climate became unstable. Now imagine this layered on top of rising seas. You live in a world already losing land to the ocean. Then temperatures crash. Weather becomes chaotic. Ecosystems shift. If you are an ancient observer, it does not look like gradual climate change. It looks like the sky and sea turning against you. A world unraveling. And yet, humanity did not vanish. We adapted. We moved inland. We followed retreating coastlines. We carried seeds, tools, stories, and in those stories, the flood remained. Not as a slow tide creeping up year by year, but as a single overwhelming event. Because memory compresses. Generations of shoreline retreat can become one sacred deluge in oral tradition. Centuries of instability can become a divine reset. The human brain does not archive in spreadsheets, it archives in narrative. So when we hear of a great flood that covered the world, we are not necessarily hearing meteorology. We may be hearing compressed history, the emotional truth of a planet in transition. Here is the unsettling thought. Modern civilization developed during an unusually stable climate period known as the Holocene. For roughly 10,000 years, temperatures stabilized. Sea level rise slowed. Coastlines settled. Agriculture flourished. Cities emerged. History, as we record it, began. But before that stability, the planet was volatile, and humans lived through it. The flood myths may not describe one single wave crashing over the entire globe in a single afternoon. They may describe something more complex, something slower, something relentless. The memory of watching the ocean take back the world. And if that is true, then the flood stories are not fantasies. They are warnings. Because the ocean is still there. It is still capable of rising. And once again, coastlines are shifting. But this time, we measure it in satellite data. We model it in climate simulations. We debate it in conferences. Ancient people had only myth. We have numbers, but the sea does not care about either. So the question is no longer whether ancient flood myths were real. The better question is this: how much of them were memory? And how much of that memory are we beginning to relive? Because if the Ice Age taught humanity anything, it was this: the ocean always comes back. And when it does not ask permission. The world that drowned the sea does not conquer all at once. It advances, it tests, it returns, and sometimes it surges. Around 14,600 years ago, something changed in the rhythm of melting ice. Glaciers that had held their shape for thousands of years destabilized. Ice sheets fractured. Vast reservoirs of fresh water, lakes trapped behind walls of ice, burst free. This event is known today as Meltwater Pulse 1A. In geological language, it was abrupt. In human language, it was terrifying. Sea levels rose roughly 20 meters in only a few centuries. That is not a slow drowning. That is a generational catastrophe. Imagine your grandparents pointing to a distant line of trees and saying, "That used to be the shoreline." Imagine watching that line disappear. Then imagine it happening again and again. There was once a land connecting Britain to mainland Europe. It stretched across what is now the North Sea. It was not barren tundra. It was rich, forests, rivers, wetlands filled with animals. We call it Doggerland, but the people who lived there did not call it that. To them, it was simply home. Archaeologists have dredged up tools from beneath the North Sea floor. Harpoons carved from bone, stone blades shaped by human hands. Proof that people thrived there. And then the water came. At first, the lowlands flooded gradually as seas rose, but around 8,200 years ago, something dramatic occurred. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway triggered a tsunami known as the Storegga Slide. Waves surged across the North Sea basin. For communities already living on a shrinking landscape, this would not have been just another storm. It would have felt like annihilation. Imagine watching the horizon suddenly rise. Imagine having nowhere higher to run. Doggerland did not disappear in a single afternoon, but for many of its people, it may have ended that way. And as survivors migrated inland into what would become Britain and Scandinavia, they carried memory with them of a land swallowed by sea. Further south, another basin waited. Today, We call it the Black Sea. But thousands of years ago, some researchers believe it may have been a freshwater lake, cut off from the Mediterranean. Then something shifted. As global sea levels rose, the Mediterranean climbed higher and higher, until it reached the natural barrier at the Bosporus. When it finally overtopped that barrier, water did not trickle through. It exploded. According to one hypothesis, Mediterranean water poured into the Black Sea basin with unimaginable force, possibly at a rate hundreds of times greater than Niagara Falls. A roaring cascade carving through rock, an unstoppable torrent filling the basin. Coastal settlements along the old freshwater shoreline would have watched the horizon transform. The water would not have crept forward politely. It would have surged. In months, perhaps in years, entire valleys drowned. Former farmland vanished beneath brackish depths. If you were standing there would be no geological explanation. There would be only one conclusion. The sea had broken loose, and this pattern repeats. Off the coast of India lies the submerged site of Dwarka. Near Japan, the underwater structure at Yonaguni sits beneath the waves. In the Mediterranean, Pavlopetri rests below modern sea level. Not all submerged structures are lost cities. Some are natural formations. Some were drowned gradually as seas rose. But the pattern is undeniable. Much of early human habitation hugged coastlines that are now underwater. We are searching for our origins in the wrong places, because the oldest chapters of human civilization may lie beneath the sea. The ocean does not preserve cities the way deserts do. It erases, it buries, it scatters. So, when we look for evidence of ancient catastrophe, we are often staring at absence, and absence is difficult to measure. But the physical evidence for rising seas is overwhelming. Coral reefs record past sea levels in their growth rings. Sediment cores reveal abrupt influxes of salt water. Ancient shorelines lie deep beneath modern waves. This was not a mythic flood. It was a real transformation of the planet. Yet here is the key insight. To a civilization without written records, centuries blur. If your great-great-grandparents told of the land once stretching miles farther into the sea, if your grandparents witnessed a catastrophic storm that erased the last of it, and if you grew up hearing those stories repeated by firelight, what would you call it? You would not describe it as post-glacial isostatic adjustment. You would call it the Great Flood. Now return to the Younger Dryas. Around 12,800 years ago, the climate shifted abruptly. Temperatures plummeted in the northern hemisphere. Glacial conditions partially returned. Weather patterns destabilized. Some researchers have found evidence of massive wildfires during this period. Charred layers embedded in sediments across continents. So there are microscopic spherules, tiny melted droplets, suggesting intense heat events. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that fragments of a comet may have exploded in the atmosphere, igniting fires and disrupting climate. This theory remains debated, but whether caused by freshwater disruption of ocean currents or something from space, the result was the same: rapid, destabilizing change. Combine that with rising seas, and the world becomes unpredictable. If you are a hunter-gatherer society living near a river mouth, you may experience flooding, sudden cold snaps, massive storms, wildfires, animal migrations disappearing. The sky and sea no longer behave. It does not take a literal planet-wide tidal wave to create a myth of apocalypse. It only takes enough chaos to convince people the world they knew has ended. And here is where psychology enters the story. Human memory is not archival, it is narrative. We compress long sequences into symbolic events. We merge overlapping disasters into a single turning point. We assign agency to forces we cannot control. Flood myths around the world often include similar elements: a warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a mountain peak where waters recede, a new beginning. This structure is not random. It encodes survival. The warning represents knowledge passed down. The vessel represents preparation. The mountain represents higher ground. The new beginning represents migration and rebuilding. Myth is not just story. It is instruction disguised as legend. And if waters rise again, seek elevation. If climate shifts, gather supplies. If disaster looms, preserve life. In this sense, flood myths are not primitive misunderstandings of weather. They are memory systems, ancient data storage. But there is one more unsettling layer. Around the end of the Ice Age, human populations expanded. Tools improved. Trade networks grew. Some researchers speculate that complex coastal cultures may have existed earlier than we assume. If such cultures were concentrated along shorelines now submerged, then their archaeological traces may be permanently lost. Not because they never existed, but because the sea reclaimed them. We often think civilization began around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago with agriculture and stable river valleys. But what if earlier experiments in complexity occurred along coastlines during unstable times? And what if those experiments were erased? Flood myths might then preserve more than environmental trauma. They might preserve cultural memory of a lost world. Not Atlantis in the romantic sense, but something more human. Communities wiped out by rising waters. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The flood myths do not require a single global deluge. They require a period of instability severe enough to imprint itself on collective consciousness across continents. And the end of the Ice Age fits that description disturbingly well. Sea levels rose more than 120 meters. Entire land bridges vanished. Climate swung violently. Coastlines retreated thousands of kilometers in some regions. That is not myth. That is geology. And yet, something still feels unresolved. Because flood myths do not only describe water, they describe judgment, reset, cleansing, the destruction of corruption. Why would environmental catastrophe become moral narrative? Perhaps because survival demands meaning. If the world collapses without reason, it is chaos. If it collapses because the gods are displeased, it becomes lesson. Order restored. Humans are meaning-making creatures. We transform trauma into theology. We encode catastrophe as warning. But beneath the symbolism, the memory remains. Water rose. Land vanished. Only the prepared survived. And here is where the story turns toward us. Modern sea levels are rising again. Not meters per century like during meltwater pulses, but rising. Glaciers retreat. Ice sheets destabilize. Coastal cities measure encroaching tides with instruments instead of intuition. We do not need myth to see it. We have satellites. But our ancestors did not. They had only story. And perhaps those stories were not exaggerations. Perhaps they were compressed recollections of a world in transition. But there is still one final layer to uncover. Because if the end of the Ice Age created the flood memory, what triggered the instability itself? Was it purely natural? Was it celestial? Or was it part of a larger planetary cycle? And if sudden climate shifts happened once before, could they happen again? In the next segment, we confront the most controversial possibility of all. That something from the sky may have accelerated the end of the old world. And if that is true, then the flood myths are not only about rising water. They are about how fragile civilization truly is. Memory of the end. If the floods were memory, then what triggered the ending? Because sea level rise explains the drowning of coastlines. But it does not fully explain the shock. It does not explain the abrupt climate reversal 12,800 years ago. It does not explain why the warming world suddenly snapped back into near glacial cold in a matter of decades. Something disrupted the system, and the debate over what that something was is still unfolding. When scientists examine layers of sediment from the end of the Ice Age, they see something unusual. A thin, dark band appears across multiple continents. So within that band are microscopic spherules, tiny droplets of melted material. There are elevated levels of platinum. There are signs of widespread burning, charcoal embedded in soil from North America to parts of Europe. These findings led some researchers to propose a dramatic hypothesis. Fragments of a comet exploded in Earth's atmosphere. Not a single impact crater like the one that ended the dinosaurs, but an airburst event, multiple explosions in the sky, igniting wildfires across vast regions. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It is controversial. Some evidence supports it. Some studies challenge it. But imagine living through such a moment. The sky brightens. The air ignites. Firestorms rage across landscapes already destabilized by melting ice. And even if the comet theory proves incomplete, we know this much. The climate shifted rapidly. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere plunged. Ecosystems faltered. Large animals like mammoths disappeared in many regions. Human populations adapted or migrated. To a modern scientist, this is climate oscillation. To a human being standing beneath a darkened sky, it would have felt like the end. Here is the key realization. Civilization depends on stability. Agriculture depends on predictable seasons. Cities depend on reliable water sources. Trade depends on navigable coastlines. Remove stability, and complexity collapses. The end of the Ice Age was not just an environmental event. It was a filter. Only cultures capable of adapting survived, and those who survived did not forget. And they encoded the lesson. Flood, fire, cold, darkness, reset. But why flood specifically? Why does water dominate the mythic narrative more than fire or ice? Because water reshapes geography. Fire scars the land. Ice retreats. But water erases boundaries. It redraws maps. When sea level rises by 120 meters, the world is no longer recognizable. Coastal plains vanish. Islands form. Peninsulas detach. Entire regions become unreachable. Imagine showing a person from 15,000 years ago a modern map. They would not recognize it. Their world was physically larger in some areas. The sea had not yet claimed the continental shelves. When it did, it was not just environmental change, it was cartographic amnesia. The world they knew ceased to exist. And so, the flood becomes more than water. It becomes the death of geography. Consider the structure of flood myths again. There is always a remnant, a chosen few, a vessel, a mountain peak, a new beginning. This is not random storytelling. It mirrors the pattern of human survival at the end of the Ice Age. Populations contracted, groups migrated to higher elevations or inland territories. Some regions became uninhabitable, others flourished. Genetic studies show bottlenecks in certain populations around this time. Not extinction, but narrowing. Survival under pressure. If you compress that across generations, it becomes a sacred narrative. The world was destroyed. Only a few survived. They rebuilt. Now shift forward, for roughly 10,000 years after the Younger Dryas ended. Earth entered an unusually stable climate phase, the Holocene. This stability allowed agriculture to emerge in multiple regions independently. The Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River Basin, Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley. Permanent settlements became cities. Cities became civilizations. We call this the dawn of history. But it is more accurate to call it the dawn of stability. Because without stable climate and coastlines, civilization struggles to anchor itself. Which raises a profound question. What if stability is the exception, not the rule? What if the last 10,000 years are unusually calm compared to deeper time? And what if ancient flood myths are echoes from a more chaotic planetary era? There is another unsettling implication. If flood myths are memories of real environmental upheaval, then they are not just stories about the past. They are case studies. Humanity survived rapid sea level rise before. Humanity survived climate shocks before. But the population was smaller, technology simpler, infrastructure non-existent. Today, nearly half of the global population lives near coastlines. Megacities sit barely above sea level. Ports, power plants, financial centers, all within reach of rising tides. We often frame climate change as a gradual economic problem, but history suggests it can also be a narrative shock. When familiar coastlines change, identity shifts. When maps change, politics change. When resources shift, conflict follows. Our ancestors encoded that instability as divine judgment. Oh, we encode it as data, but the physics does not care how we interpret it. Now consider one final possibility. Some cosmological models suggest that comet activity in the inner solar system may fluctuate over long timescales. The Younger Dryas impact theory, whether fully validated or not, forces us to confront a truth. Earth exists in a dynamic cosmic environment. Climate can shift from internal processes. It can also shift from external triggers. The sky is not inert. Ancient cultures often described catastrophe as descending from above. Fire from the heavens, a burning star, a dragon in the sky. Modern science separates myth from mechanism, but the emotional core remains. Sudden change feels like invasion. And yet, despite everything, the rising seas, the climate reversals, the possible firestorms, humanity did not vanish. We adapted, we reorganized, we told stories. Those stories carried forward lessons. Move to higher ground, preserve knowledge, prepare for instability. Flood myths are not simply tales of destruction. They are survival manuals encoded in metaphor. They say, "The world can change faster than you expect. Be ready." Now return to the present. Satellite measurements show global sea levels rising by millimeters each year. Ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica lose mass. Extreme weather events intensify in some regions. We debate timelines, we argue over models, but beneath the noise is a simple truth. The coastline is not permanent. It never was. The only reason we think it is stable is because we live in a narrow window of geological calm. If that calm shifts, future generations may tell stories about us. Stories of cities lost to water. Stories of warnings ignored. Stories of those who prepared and those who did not. And perhaps thousands of years from now, those stories will become myth. Compressed, symbolic, sacred. A tale of a great flood that reshaped the world. So were the ancient flood myths real? Not as a single wave covering the entire planet in one afternoon, but as memory? As compressed recollection of a planet in violent transition? Very possibly. They are not evidence of supernatural punishment. They are evidence of human observation. of resilience, of the instinct to remember. And if there is one final lesson hidden within them, it is this: civilization is not guaranteed, stability is not permanent, and the ocean always remembers the shape of the land it once covered. It is patient, it is powerful, and it will return wherever physics allows. The difference between myth and history is simply time.